Today, we're talking about the nature of evil. Where does it come from? How does it originate? And how does it mechanize itself? I'm borrowing a lot from this book, Dispelling Evil, The Virus of Wetiko by Paul Levy. And I'll be using his terminology for it as well, which is also borrowed a lot from Jack Forbes and Native American cultures within the US. But before we talk about evil, we need to establish some groundwork. The idea that I, approach things from a psychological standpoint, and my perspective is always that everything just comes down to psychology. I also have a spiritualist background, as you may or may not have seen in my other videos. So that's the framework from which I, launch off of. But I'm also very much into science, though obviously not officially trained myself. Do appreciate and consider myself having the scientific attitude, which is follow the evidence and test the evidence, and then follow that evidence. So essentially, what we're going from is Carl Jung and the idea of archetypes. In a more general sense, that evil itself is an archetype. So Paul Levy borrows this term Wetiko from many indigenous cultures in the US. And ultimately, Wetiko, in the Cree tradition, I believe, is the idea of a psychological parasite that can infect a person, and when it does, it makes them cannibalistic, both literally but also figuratively. And he expands on this idea a bit more to broaden it. And the idea that Wetiko is not just in that specific case, but we could argue that it is a psychological virus that has infected humanity. Wetiko is essentially something that exists in every single person, being that it is an archetype. The archetypes are essentially patterns of organization within the human psyche. Similar to how there's natural patterns of organization in nature. For example, water falling down a valley will always find the most efficient way to fall down that valley and will continue that way. And we can say that there's certain patterns of behavior. If this, then this will happen. We've measured this and we can see this across different cultures, how we have all these different cultures with different belief systems and traditions, spanning the ages even, not just geography, and yet they still come up with the similar tropes, the idea of the old wise person or the village fool. These are common to not just cultures, but ultimately to our psyche itself. Now, so then that begs the question, what is the subconscious or unconscious? And ultimately, what the subconscious is a collected data set that all humans have within them. And from more of a modern Western approach, we have the idea that consciousness arises in the mind, essentially. But what I've come to understand and what I would challenge is that it's more of a body thing. That when we think of our feelings and our thoughts, there isn't something over here that's called mind or mental, and over here that's body and gross matter. It's the same thing, in that it's ultimately the body that comes first and is primary, and our understanding of the mind and our conception of it is what is secondary and essentially virtual. It's just kind of like, it doesn't apply to the actual system. It's just like a phoneme we created to help us remember how to deal with this system and how to work it, Ultimately, it's useful, but it's not accurate, an accurate description of reality in itself. This is what I would say about the mind. That the mind is just an abstract study mechanism that we use to help us understand it, ourselves, and the world around us. But isn't itself the propagator of this experience. Our bodies are, and that within our bodies there is hidden wisdom, so that as we grow and develop as humans, this same data set or collection of cultural and species-wide knowledge, is available to us. It's similar in the sense of how a spider knows how to spin a web, even though no one's ever taught it how to spin a web. It's instinctual. Coming to humans, we're a bit more complicated than, some other animals, so our collective unconscious of data is also a lot more complicated. We're also talking about thousands of years of culture and development, and also traditions and cultures that knew about this and knew how to deal with these archetypes and cultivate them. So we're talking about something that's layer upon layer upon layer, and ultimately it is the subconscious. As much as we talk about it, we still can never know it because it is the opposite, The minute you know it, it stops being unconscious. It becomes conscious. That's not to say that there can't be a balance of the two. That is ultimately the goal of human growth and mature and development. That ultimately the subconscious is like an automatic mechanism within the psyche. It's easy to draw analogies to the body. Like we have an immune system within our bodies that is very easily seen and measured, and we can see the effect of it and how it behaves, the mechanism of it. And we also understand that it is automatic and why it's automatic and that it needs to be automatic, and that's how it evolved. If we had an immune system that we had to think about and be like, okay, immune system, kick in, we would die and the genes wouldn't get passed on. So our subconscious is similar in this aspect. That's not the only thing the subconscious does. It is so far more much complicated than that. But that is definitely one of its main functions, is to be an inner healing mechanism for the mind, soul, and body. Within this subconscious, there are different parts of the subconscious that do different things. The shadow, for example, which is the aspect of ourselves that we suppress, the behaviors and things about ourselves that we don't like, so we would suppress it as an attempt to separate it from ourselves. But ultimately that's impossible. This is also where psychological projection happens, that the assumptions, especially the negative ones, the assumptions you make about another person or situation that you don't have direct knowledge or experience of, is usually reflection of your shadow. That these are actually your dark aspects that you don't want to own, and therefore are putting onto someone else for them to own, to be like, hey, you're responsible for this, well, instead of me. And there's other elements of within the shadow, but also within the subconscious as a whole, that ultimately, so me, myself, am the conscious mind. The fact that I'm able to talk about myself and be aware of myself and this experience I'm having is the conscious self, whereas my subconscious self is a whole other entity within me. That is to say that the individual, I, Andre Pontes, is not Andre Pontes, the one talking and thinking, but is actually a subsection or a part of Andre Pontes, what we call the ego. The one that says, I want, I do, I think. That's the ego. When this gets overblown, then it becomes unhealthy and, leads to unhealthiness. But to get rid of all, have no ego, which is often said in a lot of spiritual traditions, that ultimately I think is also not healthy either. It's, both extremes, both ends of the spectrum. And what life has shown us and what the spirit world has shown us, it is always about balance. You need the ego. It's not in charge, and it shouldn't be in charge, but it does have a function, and an important function that it needs to fulfill in order for this version for this entity, this individual, this organism that I am, to succeed. That's not to say that having an egoless experience should be shunned or not sought after. That definitely should be sought after. That's a part of the work and the healing and psychological development in itself. We need to have the experience of the egoless in order to understand things that aren't ego, in order to transcend our own boundaries, our own understandings, our own experience and emotions, and ultimately ourselves, to literally feel what another organism, situation, or life itself, or reality itself beyond us, apart from us, is experiencing and feeling. That is only possible through an egoless state of being. Now, the argument of whether to stay in that state of being or not, I don't know enough about that, but my personal opinion is that to stay there permanently, one, is very, very, very difficult, and just to expect, the everyday person to just aspire to that is a tall order. I think it's much more approachable and much more beneficial to society as a whole to have moments of egolessness. There's also the dark side of egolessness, where people are just full on out of touch with reality and are very destructive either to themselves or others, and it's just not a good look, and it's not healthy, and it's not okay. So there's always a dark side to everything. Even when we're when we're not conscious, there's that dichotomy of light and dark in everything. So not only do you have a dichotomy of conscious and subconscious, but then you also have light and dark, literally. And that's always present in every aspect of life and level of reality until you get to the one where all paradoxes equalize and the idea of separation just doesn't exist. But that's a subject matter for a different storyline, and that is ultimately a very unique thing in of itself. It is also ultimately always present, so we're technically living in it now, so it's not a dichotomy or paradox to have both oneness and separation at the same time. It just is. The separation is kind of more like a diluted version of that, a diluted version of the ultimate reality or the truest form of reality, and that the physical world is the same thing as the oneness, but just on a lower resolution. This is very oversimplified, but it helps. So then what is evil? Because we still need to understand that if we're talking about evil, we're talking about many interpretations here of the enjoyment of suffering of others, and also the wanting to cause the suffering of others, to seek it out purposefully and intentionally. It can also be unintentional, which is very much also part of the case, but that also starts to speak more towards the subconscious nature of evil and what is Wetiko in itself. But we'll get to that. In order to explain what is evil, we need to explain what is the self. So if the self is this higher unified state of all being, and then that everything that we experience as humans or other organism in this level of reality, where does that fit in? And don't get too carried away with the idea of hierarchy, but we can think of it as a hierarchy, that you have this oneness at the top of the structure, and then different levels of reality forming a structure, and we're like somewhere in the middle. So you have this tiered levels of reality. And then when we think of archetypes or entities or gods or spirit or beings and spirits, they're on higher planes of existence. I come back to a lot to this short story because I absolutely love it, and there's a lot of truth to it. Andrew Weil's The Egg, an incredible short story. And the idea that this world, this planet, even this universe is actually just one spiritual entity developing, trying to learn and grow itself in order to evolve and mature, or in order to be even born. That this whole universe is actually the fetus of a god developing. That it's not a god yet, but it will. And that it needs to have all these different experiences. Because remember, time doesn't, I'm not going to say exists, because that can't be accurate, but it doesn't work the same way that does here. Time is just like a different, smaller dimension that you can like hold and move around in however you want, whereas we are bound by time and can't do that. So the idea being that you could travel backwards in time, you're essentially you're reincarnating various times into different lives to learn and experience and retain the knowledge and experience and emotions of those lifetimes. But it's not just moving forward, but you could reincarnate backwards in time and therefore interact with yourself. And then ultimately, I should have said spoiler alert, every single entity in the universe is you, just experiencing at different perspectives and different moments. And that all this collective experience is what enables a god to be born. So that then, the god is born and lives in their level of reality with other gods. And then who's to say that they didn't happen again, that ultimately all these gods are also just but the fingers of one hand. So on and forward up until the oneness, the true level of reality, which is that which is, that this is that which is that, it is beyond description, it is beyond words. The fact that you try to delineate it makes it inherently limited and therefore not able to describe the infinite and the unlimited. The words themselves fail to describe, because ultimately the model does not replace reality. It is a tool to help understand reality, but it never will be reality. So from that perspective, we can understand that there's things beyond our realm that affect this realm and structures that kind of inform this realm. But what about this realm? Well, when we think of evil in the very real world sense, or at least in the very physical world sense, we think of atrocities that have happened throughout the world and throughout history that are happening right now. We think of one-to-one interactions with the individuals in our lives, the people in positions of power that get to make decisions that for thousands of and millions of other humans that they don't have the right to make. So when we define evil, or when we ask ourselves what is evil, that's ultimately what we think of. But then what if evil itself was its own entity, a spirit that lives beyond? And this is what the idea of Wétiko comes from. In certain Native American traditions, Wetiko was a disease that infected humans, turning them into cannibals, and they became kind of like mindless, automatic creatures that just cannibalized other humans, and honestly, just anything that came across its path. We can think of sociopathic serial killers in a similar sense, that their only interest is the one thing, is the killing, and that's all they focus on. But that they themselves are not Wetiko, they are infected by it. That this is a psychological archetype that is coming from the spirit, or if you're seculars, the virtual realm of mind and thought and emotion that may not be physically real, but because it informs, and we can think of how the software in my computer isn't physically real. It looks like a bunch of windows and panes and maybe even a little 3D space it can explore. And the video game I play, I'm walking around in 3D and interacting with things, but it is not physically real. It is still ultimately a 2D screen, an illusion convincing me that it is physical. That also does not mean that it's not, one, important or any less real, and two, we can tell this because of its effect. This is a very watered down simplification, but if for the secularists and atheists among you, you can think of the spirit world as this, a virtual reality that informs matter through its effect, and that it's a constant feedback loop. So you end up having this dichotomy, two layered reality of a physical reality and a virtual reality that are constantly exchanging information. That is an idea I borrow from Irvin Laszlo. Wetiko, or evil, is a being or a pattern within this virtual realm that informs the physical realm, our own. But let's talk about behaviors, because then ultimately what happens is when someone's infected with Wetiko, what happens is it plays on the subconscious. And it plays on the subconscious through fear. That when we are afraid of reality, a disconnect happens because we're too caught up in the motion, because fear is very painful. And it's good that fear is painful. It evolved that way and it helped us necessary. But the problem is when fear gets excessive, when the fear doesn't end. Fight or flight mode is supposed to end. It's supposed to be short bursts to help us deal with, life-threatening situations. But when we're not dealing with life-threatening situations, we're not supposed to be in fight or flight. And that's when our nervous system starts to fail and starts to get sick, both physically and psychologically. And ultimately, when a human spends too much time in this fear, in this unhealthy psychological state, it's very similar to when when you have an infection and it festers. The infection grows and builds. And here we can use the analogy of cancer to help us understand this. That a cancer cell kind of goes rogue and says, you know what? I'm separate from all of you. I'm not a part of you. I'm doing my own thing. And not only that, but I'm going to make all of you do my thing. And then we can see the need to want to spread and also to consume and conquer. Fear leads to solipsism, in a sense, in that if the awareness of reality can invoke fear, because it's like, oh, that's separate from me. If it's separate from me, it can kill me. And if it can kill me, then I need to protect myself. How do I protect myself? Well, the only things that don't make me afraid are things that look like me, things that are me, and therefore anything that looks like me will make me feel like they are me. So I need to make everything around me like me, or even more so, to make it me, to reflect my image back at me, because that's the only thing that makes me feel safe. It's also a very automatic response. And so that this then grows on to, we can think of human examples. Racism is a perfect example. I'm only comfortable with things that look like me and that think like me and that experience reality the way I experience. Because if I am challenged, if I experience or come in contact with something that does not have the same experience with me, then there's the thought in the back of, well, what if I'm wrong? Well, what if I don't understand reality? And there, that is a valid experience and my experience is wrong. Now, ultimately, the problem here is that dichotomous thinking, but the reason that this affects us so strongly is because if I'm wrong, if I'm not understanding reality, then I can't protect myself against reality. And therefore, I'm going to die. Because the fear of death and the threat of death is just as painful or even more painful than death itself, from a psychological standpoint. And this is what the motivator is for such behaviors of also wanting to avoid that experience. Like, no, I can't do that. And if I can't do that, you can't do that, because otherwise you're going to make me self-aware and self-conscious. And self-awareness is the real key here, because ultimately, in order to become self-aware, we must become not only aware of our mortality, but we must accept our mortality. We must feel the fear that, yes, I will die one day, and there's nothing I can do about it. Momentos mori, and that this is that whole existential crisis, but not just on an intellectual, but on an emotional level, on a soul level, that a human needs to experience this and go through it in a safe setting, obviously, but needs to go through this. And usually, and this is where cultural traditions and especially religious and spiritual traditions came in, is that was the vehicle, that was the vessel to help birth this process. And when we lost track of these cultures and traditions and practices as a modern society, that process gets interrupted. And not only interrupted, but just lost. The awareness of this is happening, why is this happening, just becomes lost, and we spend, the next thousands of years trying to recreate it through art, trying to come up with new names for it and understand what is this experience going on. When we look back at ancient cultures, they already knew, and they're like, oh no, that's this, you need to pay attention to this is important. It doesn't matter what, all humans need to go through this and are gonna go through this. Because what we think of as insanity, from the TV Hollywood perspective, from an unhealthy standpoint and detrimental standpoint, the thing that we're, the boogeyman we're all afraid of, that is ultimately what that collection of behavior is ultimately when the process of existential crisis, the process of psychological awareness and psychological rebirth is interrupted or worse, held in transition. That the process doesn't go through fruition and is stuck in between. That then is where we get these pathological symptoms that are ultimately detrimental. In short bursts, they're transformative and helpful, but in long, drawn out, especially in a society that encourages it to be long and drawn out, this is what causes problems. But even before that, if one is trying to avoid that experience altogether, we get the most detrimental and destructive forces and movements and isms that we are encountering and have encountered as a species. And that's where Wetiko proliferates, because, and I'm using various, it is ultimately like these things, but not them, or it could be said, is the birthplace of them. I've used analogies of cancer and viruses. It spreads like a virus by replicating itself. Ultimately, that when you lash out at someone or explode at someone, you're essentially sneezing on them psychologically to infect them with your trauma. And that's how Wetiko proliferates. But also, it is parasitic. And the goal of a parasite is for you to not know the parasite is there, to invade the body and then control it without the host knowing that it's being controlled. This is where the subconscious aspect of it comes in. So the belief that not only am I not scared, not only am I not the problem and you're the problem, but I am in control and I am more rational than you are. And that no matter what information you present me, even very logical and obvious information that my perspective is wrong and that I'm out of touch with reality, I will never accept that or come to terms with it because I'm just too fucking scared. and then it's just an automatic process. So then you have a person infected with Wétiko, with the parasite, the parasite controlling it, in a sense. Well, what then happens? Well, the system self-organizes. Its goal is to proliferate, as any living organism does. It wants to produce and spread and proliferate and survive. So how does it do that? By spreading the infection, by getting other people infecting and creating a group that is infected. Because that ultimately, when you have a consolidated group like that, we can think of like cult culture and like cult in the unhealthy sense of, secting off a group of people, controlling how they think and how they feel, so that even when other people come into that group, even well-intentionally, they don't accept it, they fight back, and ultimately, end up killing the other, whoever the other is. The other doesn't really matter, as long as there just have to be other. So then we see that on a collective scale. Now, if we imagine that this has already happened and has been happening for thousands of years, ultimately, you're gonna get special interests. You're gonna get groups who do become, it can't be everyone, but there is a certain level of awareness. Evil isn't completely unconscious. It's when evil becomes conscious that it becomes even more destructive. I know that I'm doing is wrong and destructive. I want to do that. A lot of the times people give themselves excuses. Oh, they deserve it. It's their fault I'm doing this, And then ultimately there's people who I think is not as common, but who know that this isn't the case and just full blown in that mode and just that's what they want. But even then we have to look into the nature of where does that come from? Psychological trauma. Well, what is psychological trauma? A thing, a system out of flux that did not heal itself. And the only way that could happen is because that system got injured a long time ago. So it went through something it wasn't supposed to go through. But going back a bit, so then we have a group of people who are Wetikoized, who are infected with this virus, with this illness, and some who purposefully proliferate and orchestrate and organize. Then we can think of sociopathic, politicians and CEOs of corporations and, people hiding behind boardroom doors who all think alike. And you need to understand that it doesn't necessarily need a formal organization. It doesn't necessarily need, although that also happens and can happen, it doesn't need people to go, oh, you're one of me, let's only get that. Even though that happens a lot. We see this through racism in America. The entire history of America is racist white people being like, oh no, we only want people like us. We're going to purposely design society to be beneficial for people like us and who think like us. And though no one's going to know, because if we let it out openly, then we can lose our power. But on the hidden veils and unconscious, and it's not, and it wasn't that hidden, or is that hidden? But literally to the neighborhood districts of the U.S. are physically designed to be racist. When people who think alike get together, they already share the same behaviors. They're just gonna reenact those behaviors, and that those behaviors get amplified by the amount of people collected. That we see in chaos theory a lot, that the tipping point is a system is when many different points of that system start flowing more towards one behavior or avenue than towards the other. There's chaos, and then order arises sporadically. But that is also true of the opposite sense, that beneficial and healthy order can arise sporadically, and the tipping point can go the other way. But ultimately, yes, that you have a group of individuals and collections of humans who follow a certain behavioral pattern and want to proliferate that behavioral pattern. We can think of media as a very good example of this. The media controls how we perceive and interact with the reality around us. And we're watching media since the minute we're out of the womb, People are showing their kids phones, they're distracting them. Now, that's not to say 2D screens are inherently destructive and unhealthy. It is always about the application and the use. However, we live in a society that purposely doesn't teach us how to deal not only with two-dimensional screens conveying information to us and manipulating us emotionally, but purposely makes us, as much as possible, unaware of our emotional state. Like, psychology is not taught in high school or in kindergarten as it should. Like, emotional maintenance and sanitation and awareness is not taught in schools, and it should be. Like, it is the first thing that we need to learn as an organism on this planet is, what does it mean to be an organism? What does it mean to be aware that I'm an organism? That there are rules and mechanisms at play here that if I don't understand or make use of, it's gonna hurt me and affect me in life. Essentially similar to if you bought a new piece of equipment that was very complicated, you didn't know how it worked, you're gonna wanna read the instruction manual. Well, we're all being born without instruction manuals and purposely having those instruction manuals withheld from us to keep us as impotent as possible and as incapable of defending ourselves as possible. Because then that becomes easier to cultivate us and to infect us and manipulate us into the ways that, those in power want us to go. TV screens and all other screens, and essentially anything that's a 2D surface that conveys information, is constantly used to program us, to program how we think, how we feel, how we react to the world. And most importantly, not on a conscious level, but on a subconscious level. That when something happens, they want you to behave in the way they want you to behave, Especially with fear. That when your fear, literally the shapes your body's gonna take and what it's gonna do is something that they want to program. They being the, quintessential, ambiguous, those in power who can control those who aren't. This is also an oversimplification, and ultimately the idea that ultimately no one has power over you unless you give it to them. You always have power over yourself. You need to take it and remember that. So how to deter this? How to prevent this? How to practice psychological health and maintenance? Well, ultimately, the weakness of Wétiko, the weakness of a parasite that hides in the subconscious, that hides in the darkness, is to bring it to light, is to recognize and say, hey, I see you, Wétiko, I know you. And also to understand that this doesn't originate in the external world, that there's nothing I can do about it out there, at least not at first, because it starts from within. We all have evil within us. We have all the emotions, all the pantheon of gods that we've seen in polytheistic cultures. Ultimately, not only, but ultimately are talking about the different aspects of the human self, the different emotions that live within a self. We all have our Apollo and Aphrodite, but then we also have our Ares and our Hades. We have all of them within us. And it's how we cultivate these and balance them that makes for an integrated whole. So then evil itself is ultimately also within us. So that if we truly want to negate the negative effects of this, we need to take responsibility for it. That I am the source of evil in my life, and not in like a detrimental sense or like punish yourself sense. That itself is also Wétiko, manipulating you. But to acknowledge it without judgment and without shame or humiliation, to see it clearly. This is the goal. Well, how do we do such a thing? Even if you're not purposely looking for darkness and evil and you're just trying to explore yourself, this can also be very difficult. This is why outwards expression, especially artistic expression, is so important. But ultimately, just honest expression. Outlets and avenues, be it physical, through dance or exercise or sport, but also through something more emotional based, like artwork or theater or singing, and intellectual as well. That ultimately, in order to see yourself, you must, or in order to see Wétiko within you, you must explore this and express it within an artistic framework. Because that is how we bring things into consciousness, into light, and ultimately synthesize them. That we cannot have control over the world around us. That is never possible because the world is a separate thing beyond us. We are not reality, we're a part of reality. In a very similar vein that we are not the self, we are a part of the self. I am both conscious and subconscious. I am not the individual self. I am an aspect of the individual self. And that to acknowledge this and accept it is how, so we cannot have control of the exterior, but in order to have control of the interior, we need to acknowledge and accept it. But in order to do that, we need to understand that we're dealing with living entities within us. So if you want control, what you're really talking about or aiming for is cooperation. In psychology, you have this where if you want to understand the negative aspects of your behavior, to truly heal, you must go within and find the younger versions of yourself, specifically your inner child. And when they throw tantrums, when they get angry, when they get jealous or embarrassed or envious or all the negative aspects of emotion that we, try to relegate and suppress, we must sit with them and be our own parent and reparent ourselves and not judge the child, the inner child, or admonish them or punish them, but ask them and listen to them and to let them feel what they're feeling. And that is the key here when it comes to psychological healing, is that instead of suppressing, instead of trying to control, within a safe place and within reason, but you give that version of yourself an avenue of expression. You let yourself feel the pain you didn't let yourself feel previously. That ultimately, that is what trauma is. It is pain that got stuck in your body, in yourself, in your subconscious, that you did not allow that couldn't be processed because you didn't allow it to exist, to express itself. And that to truly heal from something is to let it move through you, to let it be expressed so that it can move on, so that your body can move on, that it can integrate it, accept it as a part of itself, and to become whole again. When we do this, we can recognize not only do we have authority within ourselves, we become less susceptible to psychological infection, because ultimately, like the concept of the vampire, the parasite needs to be invited in first. That ultimately, you can only get infected by allowing the infection to come in, that you are doing something on a conscious or subconscious mind, usually subconscious, to allow yourself to be infected. And then once it's invited, it wreaks havoc and takes control. But also the weakness of the parasite is that it's constantly trying to convince you that you don't have power. You don't have power or authority to remove your, powerless and weak, and to deny to you the truth of the situation, which is, this is your body. This is your home, your soul, your temple. Only you have authority over it. Now, obviously that can get hard to deal with and interpret. This is why we do things in community, and, when dealing with the psychological or spiritual self, it is always with guidance of others, and those who have gone and experts, those who have gone before. So once we have established authority within ourselves, once we cultivate our own, and ultimately we can think of spiritual practice like a physical practice. If you want your body to get healthy, it's not something you do once, it's little bits of effort over time, and getting to know, oh, well, when I do this, that muscle works, or when I do that, this part of my body does the thing. And, as you grow your practice, you explore more. Well, what if instead of 10 push-ups, I do 20 push-ups today? Can I do that? How will my body react? When I listen to my body, what does it tell me? And then, either, oh, that didn't work, or it did work, let's try something else. And then spiritual practice and growth, or psychological practice and growth, is ultimately the same thing, that little bits of effort over time will grow you, and like a tree, you grow new branches and are able to become different versions of yourself, or more refined or developed versions of yourself, and even do things you never even thought were possible, but also that were just a part of your experience of who you thought of as yourself. That the very idea of self, it's constantly in flux and changing and needs to grow. That, stagnation is the opposite of growth. When a living thing stagnates, it begins to die. So, we can even think of literally when we're sitting still in an office for hours on end, our bodies deteriorate and are deeply impacted. And not only that, but our minds and our hearts also deteriorate. Bodies need movement. Souls need movement. change and flux and growth and development. So when we establish and we become this version of ourselves, this healthy version of ourselves, there's never a final, version. There's never a limit. It is, but, when we have authority within ourselves, then it is when we are able to influence the world around us. All of it? No. But that's also not the point or what is needed. Then we can improve not only our situation, but the situation of the people around us. But ultimately, we're dealing with others, we must always listen, The way we listen to our bodies, the way we listen to our inner child, we need to extend that muscle, that practice of listening towards others and selves. Can we listen to their inner child? Can we listen to their experience without inserting our own, without saying, oh, well, sometimes that's helpful to draw an analogy of like, oh, well, this is similar when I had this experience and it made me feel that way. Perhaps that's how they're reacting. But ultimately, true listening is when you remove yourself from the experience, when you literally become a fly on the wall and you give this other organism space. You give them the space to express themselves, the space of sound, the space of heart, the space of space itself, even. And when you are able to have the experience of like, what happens when it's not about me? Can I make this not about me? Can I completely forget myself for a second and just hear this person? And that is how we, develop and grow the world around us. And it's never perfect. There's never one final answer or a clean-cut situation or solution. It's always going to be in flux and movement. Is ultimately how the world works. But then we can begin to manipulate the world around us for good and to help others. And then that way, when we interact with other individuals who are also standing in their power, who are also are able to reign over themselves, that then we can establish bonds and connections, and that when the collective body of humanity, of planet Earth, can essentially start rebuilding its tissue that has been damaged, when the hormones of the collective self can reach other tissues in other areas that aren't doing so well and that need assistance and help. And that is how we heal and grow from the infection that has infected our collective body, the body of our planet, the body of our psyche, our soul. And so to deal with, to contend with Wétiko and ultimately heal it is to acknowledge it, to acknowledge our own parts of itself, and to express it. This is why artwork is so important and powerful in this sense. This is how we connect. This is how we realize like, oh, I'm going through that too. Oh, they're going through what I went through. I know how that feels like, This isn't just me. In fact, it's not just me and that person, but a lot of us. And that when we grow this collective understanding, this collective emotional understanding, that this is ultimately the solution. This is ultimately how healing works and happens. So to end on a positive note, to end on a conclusion. One, I highly recommend this book. I'm only halfway and it's still already amazing and wonderful and mind-blowing and eye-opening. But yeah, that within your own practice, within your own self and your own life, whatever, for me, I journal, that by exploring your own internal world, by acknowledging what emotions you find and having curiosity, not having to have a definition or an understanding, being comfortable in that little in-between space that is very uncomfortable of not knowing the answer and being able to accept that, hey, I don't have an answer right now. I'm feeling a certain way. It doesn't feel good. I don't have an answer of what to do, and that's okay. Being okay with not being okay is part of the solution, is part of the process. Because only when we are able to be okay with the aspects of ourselves we don't like is when we can accept them. And when we can accept them, we can see them clearly. We accept that they exist in their own right, and then we can see them and understand them. And that is ultimately what is needed, is for us to accept that, yes, that is a separate thing from me. Yes, it is something that I don't know about, don't have control over, but because of that, I can ask questions. Because of that, I can communicate and talk. Because of that, I can listen. And I can go, well, okay, if this is happening, if this is separate from me, what is it? Let me listen. On that note, thank you for listening. And as always, thank you for being you.